day, time to play. You're off the roller coaster. You got the facts, so talk to Max.
Hi, I'm Max Whitehead, your employment law expert, bringing you a series of real-life employment stories. This episode is The Land of Drugs and Honey. This true story was published by the Employment Relations Authority in its determination dated 18th of May, 2018. For the purposes of this podcast, the story's been dramatised. Here is the employee side of the story. Beekeepers Brad and Joel were heading to their boss Tim's flat, which was near a shed used to process honey and doubled as a smoker room. Brad sensed something was up when he saw Tim standing unusually at the door, looking grim. Tim ushered Brad and Joel inside. When he entered the living room, the first thing Brad saw was two hard-looking men staring at him. It was clear that all was not going to end well. Then Brad suddenly heard the door being locked behind him. He swerved around and saw Tim blocking the exit. The two heavies drew the curtains over the windows, then produced a baseball bat and a loaded crossbow. With his heart pounding, Brad looked at Joel, who'd turned pale. Recently, Brad's boss, Tim, had been making Brad very uneasy by demonstrating extreme mood swings, shifting from hostility to hysterical laughter. Brad and Joel braced themselves to be tortured or even executed. For the next 45 minutes, Tim and his heavy mate Basil used gangster tactics, threatening and intimidating Brad and Joel while endeavouring to extract a confession to the theft of beehives. Only recently, Brad Purcell and Tim Ponder had worked together for another beekeeper. As they shared a love of drugs and honey, the pair became good mates. At some point, Tim left the job and became co-director of Eco Bees Limited with his mother, a beekeeping business in the remote part of Te Puna in the Bay of Plenty. The business placed hives in remote parts of the region and rewarded landowners for the use of their properties with honey. Soon after joining the business, Tim approached his mate Brad and asked him to work for him and his mother as manager of the hives. At the time, the New Zealand beekeeping industry was losing large amounts of hives to thieves. To make sure they wouldn't fall victim of the theft, Tim and his mother took all the precautions they could to protect their 900 hives and the manuka honey they produced. The first precaution was to locate the hives in hidden remote locations, often under bushes or out of the sight of anyone passing by. The other precaution was for Brad to live in a flat next to where the honey was processed and stored. After 45 minutes of terrifying interrogation, Brad and Joel were finally let out of the flat into the daylight. If Brad thought he had successfully convinced Tim that neither he nor Joel knew anything about the stolen hives, he was wrong. As Brad's eyes adjusted to the daylight and he inhaled his first breath of freedom, he became aware of Tim's mother, Mrs. Ponder, standing right in front of him. Whereupon she ushered Brad into a waiting helicopter, and in no time at all he was in the sky. Mrs. Ponder then demanded that Brad, using his hive's GPS locator, take her to every one of the hives that she owned. During the flight, Mrs. Ponder saw hives coloured the same as those belonging to Eco Bees, and insisted they belonged to her. Once again, Brad found himself desperately pleading for his innocence and trying to convince Mrs. Ponder that the hives were not hers, but instead belonged to a competitor. Eventually, after 2 hours of flight, Brad was returned to the rural property and told to go home. When he went to get in the vehicle he used every day to drive to and from work, he was told to find his own way home from the remote location. Brad had no choice other than to walk the many kilometres back to his home. That night, Brad and Joel laid a formal complaint at the Tauranga police station. The next day, Brad bravely returned to Eco Bees accompanied by his partner and his parents to collect his possessions and inquire about his wages. Mrs. Ponder seemed surprised when Brad told her how Tim had threatened and interrogated him. Brad then informed Mrs. Ponder that he believed Tim's behaviour was caused by the use of P or methamphetamines. He also reminded Mrs. Ponder of recently expressing to her his concerns about Tim's strange behaviour, including his erratic driving. Here is the employer's side of the story. Mrs. Ponder had been worried about Tim's drug problem for a while. She thought she'd convinced him to give up using P in 2013. In fact, the reason she invited Tim to join her in the business was to give Tim a purpose in life and to keep an eye on him. Not long later, Tim convinced his mother to employ Brad for his outstanding skills in managing multiple hives. Mrs. Ponder was acutely aware the business was at risk of being destroyed by thieves. Therefore, the location of the hives was a carefully guarded secret and entrusted to Brad as the manager of the hives. On the 14th of March, Mrs. Ponder was talking to a bank manager and needed to assess the approximate value of Ecobee's business assets. So she called Brad and asked him to confirm how many hives the business owned. Brad sent her a photo of a whiteboard. However, the report showed an approximate drop of 300 hives, nearly a 30% drop in numbers. She made no comment at the time, but later discussed the missing hives with Tim, asking him not to confront Brad, but first to investigate and get firm evidence. Tim became obsessed about the loss, but obeyed his mother's wishes and did not confront Brad. He instead accompanied Brad on his visits to the hives. However, Tim's suspicions increased. Tim decided to get to the bottom of the missing hives once and for all, hiring a helicopter to hunt for them, and later reported to his mother that he had seen the missing hives at locations not identified on the GPS. It was then that Tim concluded that Brad and Joel had something to do with the missing hives, so he made more inquiries. Tim talked to one of the farmers from a property where some of the hives had gone missing. The farmer said that a fencing contractor saw Ecobee's vehicle pick up the hives a week earlier. Tim surmised that since Brad drove an Ecobee's vehicle that was sign-written, it was likely him who took the hives. To confirm his suspicions further, the farmer also showed Tim the business card that Brad had given him. It was actually Tim's card, but his phone number had been ripped off the bottom, and Brad's was written on the card in pen. Tim again hired a helicopter. He first took photographs of where the hives had left imprints in the grass, and then of other hives that looked identical at locations not recognised by the GPS. These hive boxes were clearly in Ecobee colours, and the box design was the same as theirs. For Tim, this was too much of a coincidence. At first, Mrs. Ponder thought that Tim was being overly paranoid. However, upon seeing the evidence, she too began to think that Brad and Joel may have been responsible for the missing hives. So she agreed with Tim that they needed to get to the bottom of the issue and confront Brad. Mrs. Ponder wanted to involve the police. Tim said he was likely to get more information by confronting Brad himself. He would ensure that there would be witnesses present, so if Brad and Joel confessed, the witnesses could support him later. Mrs. Ponder reluctantly agreed and said if he failed to get Brad's confession, then she would take Brad up in the chopper and insist he identify every hive they owned. As it turned out, Mrs. Ponder did insist Brad accompany her in the helicopter and show her all the hives. However, when Brad and his partner and parents turned up the next day, Mrs. Ponder was shocked when Brad demanded his final wages. She was even more shocked to hear Brad's story of her son's interrogation tactics from the day before. The next day, Mrs. Ponder texted Brad saying that she would calculate his pay. She went on and apologised for her son's behaviour and promised to pay Brad reparation for the trauma he had suffered. She texted Brad again the next day and asked if he would confirm his resignation in writing. Brad replied, "No, I'm seeking legal advice." Mrs. Ponder texted back saying, "Does that mean you're not resigning now? Because if you are legally, you have to put it in writing." 2 days later, Mrs. Ponder wrote to Brad, asking him to return the company's property and provide a list of all the hive locations as well as the contact details of the property owners. She also said Brad's verbal resignation would be acceptable. Later that day, Brad's representative responded with a letter commencing legal proceedings for a personal grievance, alleging unjustified dismissal. The letter also strangely stated that Brad intended to return to work, but first wanted an assurance that he would be safe and would not be managed or supervised by Tim. Mrs. Ponder then sought legal advice. A week later, Brad received a letter requiring him to attend a disciplinary meeting and provide an explanation for 2 items discovered in his work vehicle. 1. The vehicle dashboard camera contained footage of Brad driving the vehicle while him and Joel was smoking marijuana and using drug paraphernalia. 2. A box containing a pipe used for smoking methamphetamines. To support the allegations, the camera footage was also sent to Brad with a letter. The letter dismissed Brad's claim of unjustified dismissal by saying Ecobees had a right to investigate the missing beehives, including questioning its staff. In response, Brad then formally submitted his written resignation. A legal battle ensued, whereupon the Employment Relations Authority were called upon to decide if Ecobees was guilty of deliberately coercing a resignation from Brad. For 2 days, Robin Arthur, who was an Employment Relations Authority member, heard from the relevant lawyers and witnesses before he made his decision. As an employment relations practitioner with 25 years of experience, it's my view the authority member should have considered the following main factors. 1. Tim's method when questioning Brad. Tim's questioning methods and behaviour were clearly unacceptable and not becoming of a fair and reasonable employer, even if Brad's account of the event was dramatic. 2. Mrs. Ponder taking Brad up in the helicopter. Brad was solely responsible for the location and whereabouts of the hives. Therefore, Mrs. Ponder was justified in taking him on a 2-hour helicopter ride and requiring him to show her the whereabouts of all the hives. 3. Brad told to walk home. What was the employer's intention when they forced Brad to walk home from that remote location after such a dramatic day? Clearly this action was deliberate and with the dominant purpose of coercing Brad's resignation. 4. Was Brad free of wrongdoing? There was convincing evidence of Brad taking drugs during working hours while driving the company vehicle. There also was circumstantial evidence placing Brad near some missing hives. Therefore, in my view, Brad himself did not bring this matter with clean hands. However, summing it all up, in my view, Brad was unjustifiably dismissed. The good news is the Employment Relations Authority also came to the same conclusion, and believe me, we don't always agree. However, on this occasion we do. The authority ordered Ecobees to pay Brad $23,483 in lost wages and $13,500 in compensation. So what should Ecobees have done when it discovered the missing hives? It should have undertaken a formal investigation that included Brad, and to be extra diligent, it could have engaged an external investigator who was familiar with the industry to undertake an independent investigation, then present Ecobees with a formal written report and recommendations. Ecobees at that juncture could have then moved on to a formal disciplinary proceedings and possibly involved the police. I hope you found this podcast interesting and entertaining. If you did, let me know, as I'm poised to bring you a series of real employment stories like this one. Until next time, this is Max Whitehead, your employment law expert, signing off.
What a day, time to play. You're off the roller coaster. You got the facts, so talk to Max.